Hello, the title of our talk is A Comparative Study of the Morphosyntax of Western Tukanoan Noun Classifiers. I'm Stephanie Farmer and my co-author is Rosa Máíhiki of the University of New Mexico. The purpose of our talk is to offer for the first time a comparison of the noun classification systems of the Western Tukanoan languages. We argue that these languages are of interest for the study of the typology of noun classification systems because they exhibit properties of both what have been called gender systems and noun classifier systems. And also because subtle differences between these languages, noun classification systems might offer insight into possible grammaticalization trajectories for gender systems. We conclude that the noun classification systems of the Western Tukanoan languages bear many similarities. In all of these languages, the possible morphosyntactic environments of classifiers are the same. In all of the languages, classifiers partition the lexicon along the same semantic divisions. And in all of the languages, classifiers serve the same pragmatic, deictic, and reference tracking functions. However, we also identify several points of variation among these languages. The first of which is that the classifier inventories of Siona, Secoya, and Koreguaje are relatively smaller than that of Máíhiki, and the classifiers have less transparent lexical origins. The classifier inventory of Máíhiki is also much larger than the inventories of these other languages. And a second major difference is that in Siona and Secoya, demonstratives, numerals, and adjectives can be bare, which is not the case in Máíhiki and Koreguaje, where they must be suffixed with a classifier. This leads to an identifiable distinction in Siona and Secoya between adnominal modification by bare modifiers and a positive modification. Such a distinction is not clear-cut in Máíhiki and Koreguaje. And just to illustrate that last point, I'd like to frame this talk a little bit with a question that has come up constantly for me in my attempts to analyze the noun phrase in Máíhiki. The phrase here consists of a distal demonstrative, the root ga, suffixed by a shape-based classifier nyaka, preceding the mass noun kiu, which is also suffixed by a shape-based classifier. And we can ask ourselves whether this demonstrative is modifying the noun and agreeing with it in gender, or whether this is a demonstrative pronoun that's been derived by a classifier that modifies the noun in apposition. And I think that the answer is that in some ways, this construction can be analyzed as either of these things. And we will argue that this kind of analytical ambiguity can lead to the different types of systems that we'll see in the study. So for an outline for our talk, we have first some background on the languages and the methods we've used. We'll discuss the similarities and differences between the classifier systems of these languages. We'll discuss what these similarities and differences can tell us, and we will conclude. But before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge the time, expertise, and labor of the language consultants who worked with us directly, as well as the language consultants from the Colombian Siona, Koreguaje, Ecuadorian Secoya, and Ecuadorian Siona communities who worked with the authors of the grammars and dissertations that we used in this study. We'd also like to acknowledge funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Science Foundation, as well as the Oswald Graduate Student Support Endowment for Endangered Language Documentation. These are the names of the people, the language consultants who worked on this study. And in particular, I would like to thank and to dedicate this talk to Alberto Mussolini Mojica, who is the language consultant that I worked with the most on Máíhiki over the years, who passed away on Saturday morning. I've made the sincerest of efforts to represent what he taught me about his language accurately, and any mistakes in this talk, of course, are my own. Just to orient ourselves within the Tukanoan language family, here is an internal classification proposed by Chacon 2014. You can see that Western Tukanoan is one of the major branches of the family. The four extant languages of Western Tukanoan branch are Máíhiki, Koreguaje, Siona, and Secoya, but Brel 2014 suggests that Siona and Secoya are actually part of a dialect continuum. So we've included data from 4 Siona Secoya dialects or languages, Ecuadorian Siona, Ecuadorian Secoya, Peruvian Secoya, and Colombian Secoya, Siona in our study. And I'm going to skip this slide for the sake of time, but it provides some information on where the languages are spoken and by how many people. You can sort of see in this map. So northern Peru, northeastern Ecuador, southern Colombia. The languages in dark green are the Western Tukanoan languages, and in light green, Eastern Tukanoan languages. This slide shows the sources of our data. For Máíhiki and Peruvian Secoya, the data come from original fieldwork by the authors of this talk, and for the other languages, we consulted published sources. The type and quantity of material differs from language to language, and we have the most data on Peruvian Secoya and Máíhiki. These are also the languages for which we have many more examples of classifiers within the context of a longer discourse. So now we're going to begin to describe some of the similarities between the Western Tukanoan classifier systems. In all of the languages, the possible morphosyntactic environments in which classifiers appear are the same. They appear on demonstratives, numerals, nominalized verbs, adjectives, and mass nouns. These examples illustrate some of the morphosyntactic environments in which classifiers appear in Máíhiki. In example 3, we see the clump classifier, gara, suffixed to the adjectival root high, which means big. We also see 2 classifiers suffixed to verb roots. The first is ro, suffixed to the verb meaning cook, to make the noun pot. And the other is the clump classifier, again, suffixed to the noun be, meaning to fill. And this is kind of a more nonce construction, be gara, the filled pot. And we also see the clump classifier suffixed to a distal demonstrative. And then in 4, a classifier tara suffixed to a numeral. Another of the similarities that I mentioned in the introduction is a similarity between the semantic divisions in the classifier inventories. In all of the languages, there is a broad pragmatic division between specified and unspecified class, which is similar to the system of Miranya described by Seifert 2005 as a division between general and specific class. And then within the specific class or specified class in the Western Tukanoan languages, there's a broad semantic division between animate and inanimate entities. Animate entities are further subdivided into masculine and feminine, and inanimate entities are further subdivided into shape-based categories. I'm going to skip this table as well, but this is meant to illustrate the semantic divisions in the classifier inventory across the 6 languages in this study. So you see masculine, feminine, unspecified, and inanimate specific for the numeral 1. Another similarity is that in all Western Tukanoan languages, a prominent function of classifiers is in establishing and tracking reference. Classifiers suffix to demonstratives form demonstrative pronouns that can be used to refer to discourse antecedents. They can also be suffixed to adjective, numeral, and nominalized verb roots to derive nouns that can narrow the potential set of reference for an interlocutor through apposition. So here's an example from an extended example from Máíhiki that shows the use of classifiers to track reference in discourse. Or to track reference across a story. So we have as context, a man is walking through the forest with his boss, and the employer wants to retrieve a baby woolly monkey from up high in a tree and asks the narrator to retrieve the monkey for him. And the narrator does so by climbing one tree and then another tree and straddling to get to the other tree, and then retrieving the woolly monkey and then climbing back down one tree and then another tree. So we see the first instance of the classifier ni, the tree classifier, in the third bubble at the bottom. It's suffixed to the mass noun sunki, and then we see it appear again, suffixed to the distal demonstrative ta. And on the next page, we'll see some more instances of this classifier. So again, suffixed to the distal demonstrative ka in the first bubble. And in the third bubble here, we have it suffixed to the discourse demonstrative inti, and the demonstrative meaning other, jeke. Then as I released him, I tried to go down this branch and then that branch, or this tree and then that tree. So you can see here that the classifier is established early in the narrative, that the referent is established early in the narrative, and the classifier is used to track which tree is being referred to throughout the course of the story. And this is a common pattern in Máíhiki. Another use of classifiers is to restrict the potential reference of a noun through apposition. This example is from Peruvian Secoya, and it is analyzed as an instance of apposition by Johnson and Levinson. So we have Haiwu Muajore Huakaihun, build me a cedar canoe, a big one. And so in this case, we have two nouns, the noun formed by suffixing the classifier to the adjective root hai, haiwu, a big one. And we have jowu, where the same classifier is suffixed to the mass noun root jo, meaning canoe. So now we have talked about the similarities between the Western Tukanoan languages with respect to their classifier systems, and we'll turn to their differences. One of the major differences that we see is in the size of the classifier inventories, and sort of relatedly, in the extent to which the classifiers are involved in the productive derivation of nouns. So Máíhiki is the most divergent in this sense. It has at least 80 classifiers, so it's much larger than those of than the inventories of the other Western Tukanoan languages, which have between 20 and 30. In Máíhiki and Koreguaje, there are classifiers that have more transparent lexical origin. So they have cognates that are free nouns in the other languages. In Máíhiki, an example of this is Máíhiki gabat, Koreguaje gawa, ring-shaped, which is cognate with the Colombian Siona free noun gawa, meaning bark. The Máíhiki set of classifiers is also possibly open, with new classifiers being formed from noun roots and verb roots. So we see the classifier tego, meaning folded shape, which comes from tego, to bend or to fold. The classifier gara, meaning clump, coming from the verb root gara, meaning to accumulate. Another interesting aspect of the Máíhiki classification system is that count nouns are pretty much all derived. In Máíhiki, there are maybe 10 nouns that are not analyzable as a root plus a classifier. Noun, tin, and animate count nouns. Noun formation through classification is extremely productive, and there's a low degree of lexicalization. So when I was using the pair video, the pair story, to elicit a text from my consultants, they came up with at least 3 different ways of saying bicycle. We have nagakadao, meaning stepping or pedaling travel machine, nagaseu meaning step machine, and daoseu meaning travel machine. The other major difference between these classifier systems is in which classifiers appear on modifiers, or whether they can or do at all. And in this sense, there are 2 major patterns. The first one we see for the Siona Secoya languages. In these languages, numerals, demonstratives, and adjectives do not often agree with the specific gender of the nouns they precede. In some cases, unspecified or generic class is used on modifiers that precede nouns. In other cases, bare modifiers precede nouns. This is the case in Peruvian Secoya. And in still other cases, modifiers with unspecified gender are indistinguishable from bare modifiers. In these languages, specific, so sex-based and shape-based classifiers are used to form pronouns, which are used for anaphoric agreement. So in this sense, they are similar to Máíhiki and Koreguaje. In the Siona Secoya languages, the unspecified generic form of the numeral 1 frequently appears adjacent to nouns. So in 9, we see an example from Ecuadorian Siona, where we have te'emosu, one young man, or a young man. And this is the generic form of the numeral 1, rather than the masculine form of the numeral 1, as it would be in Koreguaje or Máíhiki. And in 10, we see the same phenomenon in Peruvian Secoya. So we see the generic form of the numeral 1 before the masculine noun umu, instead of a masculine form of this numeral. In Peruvian Secoya, the numeral 1 can also appear bare before the noun it modifies, and Rosavejos analyzes this as a separate construction from the one that we saw before. So in 11, we say te nomio, and she analyzes this as a bare numeral, as opposed to a numeral that has generic gender. Specific classifiers in these languages are more likely to appear when the root to which they are suffixed is not adjacent to the noun it modifies. So in 12, we see an example from Peruvian Secoya of a pronominal demonstrative how, referring to a discourse antecedent, a female dog. Such a demonstrative with a specific sex-based classifier does not generally appear adjacent to a co-referential noun. So there needs to be some distance. In some cases, it is easy to distinguish a modifier that has been suffixed with a generic classifier from a bare root. So in Peruvian Secoya, there's a difference between cajaje, the pronoun, two unspecified things, versus gaja, the numeral two, bare. And there's a difference between ij versus e in many of the Siona Secoya languages. But in other cases, this distinction is less straightforward because the pronoun looks a lot like the bare demonstrative or the bare numeral, and it's not analyzable as having a suffix. So we have ha versus ha in Colombian Siona, and te versus te or te. The second major pattern in this respect is the one we find in Koreguaje and Máíhiki, where numerals, demonstratives, and adjectives nearly always agree in specific class with the nouns they modify, even if those nouns are adjacent. So Cook and Criswell for Koreguaje say that todos los modificadores en el sintagma nominal, salvo el posesivo, llevan un sufijo de género y número o clasificador que concuerda con el núcleo. And this is shown in 13 for Máíhiki, where we have the manufactured object classifier ru or nu appearing on all elements of the noun phrase, such as it is. So these two big broken machetes. In Máíhiki, language consultants say that general unspecified modifiers are only permitted when the shape of the noun is unknown to the speaker, which seems to differ from Siona Secoya, where general modifiers seem to be used when the shape can be taken for granted. So to summarize these similarities and differences, the Máíhiki classifier inventory is larger, open, and involved in productive derivation of nouns. Modifiers can be bare in the Siona Secoya languages, or they can agree with generic gender as opposed to specific gender, which leads to an apparent difference between adnominal modification and a positive modification through derived pronouns. So going back to the original point of this talk, we might ask ourselves which system can be thought of as more grammaticalized. In one sense, Máíhiki and Koreguaje appear to have more advanced systems of agreement because classifiers appear to be obligatory on all elements of the noun phrase. This might suggest that bare modifiers were a feature of Proto-Western Tukanoan, and that Máíhiki and Koreguaje are on the way to developing a more grammaticalized gender system. But in another sense, the elements of the noun phrase can be thought of as belonging to a less cohesive constituent in these languages. Because adjectives, numerals, and demonstratives all behave like nouns, it becomes analytically difficult to find the head of a noun phrase. So perhaps what we're really looking at is interrelated grammaticalization phenomena, the grammaticalization of an integrated noun phrase, and the grammaticalization of an agreement system within the noun phrase or beyond the noun phrase. We could also ask ourselves what types of divergences, what types of trajectories might have led to this divergence between these languages. Evidence from the most closely related Eastern Tukanoan language, Tanimuka, shows a classification system that seems more like that of Máíhiki and Koreguaje, because agreement appears to be obligatory on the elements of the noun phrase. So perhaps this kind of system is the older system in the Western Tukanoan language family. And a story that we might tell is that the more informative classifiers, so the specific shape-based and sex-based classifiers, are especially pragmatically useful at a distance, and we might expect less informative classifiers like the unspecified or generic classifiers to appear on modifiers that are adjacent to co-referential nouns in a positive construction. So something like this thing, the pencil, While the and then we could possibly suggest that the Secoya proto-language may have reanalyzed unspecified or general class demonstratives and numerals adjacent to nouns as bare, demonstratives and numerals, and moved in the direction of a more integrated noun phrase. So to conclude, highly integrated noun phrases and classifier agreement and appositive phrases serve similar pragmatic purposes to narrow and establish reference. But we might expect these phenomena to be inversely correlated. So we might expect to see a system that's more like the Máíhiki, Koreguaje system in languages with less integrated noun phrases, and a system that's more like the Secoya system in a language that has more integrated noun phrases. We might also expect to see more robust patterns of agreement in languages where classifiers serve a highly productive derivational function, like in Máíhiki. And one last point that I wanted to make is that that we should perhaps pay especially close attention to the pragmatics of when to use the unspecified or general classifier, because this may play a role in the grammaticalization of integrated noun phrases. Future work that we might want to do is to establish a set of parameters for distinguishing nouns in apposition from elements of an integrated noun phrase. So look at things like, more closely at things like word order and prosody. And also to take a closer look at these phenomena in Eastern Tukanoan languages to further understand their development within the family. Thank you.